안녕하십니까. 오늘도 이른 아침에 이렇게 많이 나와주셔서 대단히 감사합니다. 우리 또 특히 나경원 위원장님께서는 지금 정치, 여러분 얼마나 바쁜지 아마 상상이 가실 텐데 이렇게 나와주셔서 고맙습니다. 어제 우리 모두는 세계인 모두가 그렇겠습니다만은 미국 대통령 선거 결과를 잘 지켜봤습니다. 많은 사람들이 예상을 뒤집고 도널드 트럼프가 미국 대통령이 됐습니다. 미국이라는 나라가 세계에서 가장 중요한 나라 중에 하나이기 때문에 새 미국 대통령이 이끄는 행정부가 어떤 정책을 펴느냐 하는 데 대해서 초미의 관심을 갖지 않을 수가 없습니다. 특히 우리나라는 도널드 트럼프 대통령 당선자는 그 선거 과정에서 경제정책과 또 안보정책 이야기를 하면서 한국 이야기를 한 적이 여러 번 있습니다. 그렇기 때문에 우리나라는 더욱더 과연 트럼프 행정부가 그래서 새 행정부의 안보 또 경제정책이 어떻게 전개될 것이냐 하는 데 대해서 관심이 특별히 많습니다. 정말 다행히 오늘 우리 미국의 최고 전문가 두 분을 모시게 돼서 정말 다행입니다. 원래 이 두 분 스피커들은 여러분들이 아마 그전에도 몇 번 와서 말씀을 하셨긴 잘 아십니다만은 우리 손성훈 교수께서는 오래전에 오늘 이 스케줄이 잡혀 있었습니다. 근데 마크 놀랜드 박사는 마침 서울에서 다른 회의가 있어 왔다가 오늘 여기 와서 좋은 이야기를 해주시게 이렇게 되어 있습니다. 그래서 이 두 분께서 특히 아시아 지역, 대아시아 또 대한반도 정책에 대해서도 말씀을 해주실 테고 특히 우리 손성훈 교수께서는 이 전반적인 행정부의 경제정책에 대해서 말씀을 해주실 걸 믿고 있습니다. 저는 이 포럼을 거의 30년째 하고 있습니다만은 서울에서 유일하게 우리가 영어로 모든 걸 진행을 하고 합니다만 오늘 아침에 거의 대부분이 우리 한국 분들이기 때문에 한국말로 몇 가지 말씀드렸습니다. As I said, I don't think we need a long introduction for two speakers, but I just want to say just a few words. Dr. Son, as you know very well, is Smith Professor of Economics at California State University, Channel Islands. He teaches at various other universities as well. Importantly, he was chief economist for Wells Fargo, one of the largest banks in the United States, for many years there. And then he served as the bank president and served in various financial institutions. He sat on boards of various public institutions and the financial institutions and many other universities and colleges. But more interesting to us is actually he has been recognized one of the most accurate economic forecasters in the United States, that means in the world, by Wall Street Journal and many other the media. Actually, in 2006, the Wall Street Journal featured a story on him, and he in in 2010, he had the exclusive study. I mean, the Wall Street Journal had the exclusive study, the story on him as most accurate economist in the U.S. And then 2010, the journal named him as one of the 5 best forecasters in the U.S. You know, business forecasting is really hazardous business. He not only survived there, but he prospers there. And also he was recognized in 2012 and other years as actually one of the top most accurate economic forecasters. So we'll see what he will tell us today about Donald Trump and his administration's policy. And then we have the Mark Noland. Again, Dr. Noland has been with us a number of times before. He has been with Peterson Institute in Washington, D.C. with Fred Buxton. He has been working with him for many years, and now he is a deputy director of the Peterson Institute. And he is a prolific writer, and he is a very versatile economist. Actually, he wrote many books on trade and the macroeconomic policies, then many books on Asia, Africa, and Middle East, and North Korea. Actually, I must say he's the leading economist for North Korean economy. I mean, you know, it's just not, he talks about North Korea, not as a casual commentary. He doesn't write commentaries, but he has very, very serious, rigorous analysis of North Korean economy. In fact, he stayed 1 year at the Korea Development Institute. That's why he knows Korean economy, I mean, our economy, as well as North Korean economy so well. You know, both speakers have one common experience, and that is that both of them served Council of Economic Advisors at White House in the United States of America as senior economists, of course, under different presidents, I suppose. And so I'm very fortunate to have our 2 speakers this morning. It says you cannot have a better timing than today. And so we're very, very fortunate. Okay, with no further ado, I'd like to invite, and then the Mark Noland has to leave here by 8:15 because he has to go somewhere else. So that's why, Dr. Son, if you allow me, I would invite Mark first in the talk and have some Q&As, and then we'll have Dr. Son speak later. Okay, so with this, please join me in welcoming Mark Noland.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. It's a great honor to be here this morning, and in light of our limited time, I will try to keep my remarks short. So, as we know, we had an election yesterday in the United States. Donald Trump won the presidency. The Democrats, it appears, Hillary Clinton, won the popular vote. But in the United States, our mechanism for electing the president has an intermediary step, or an intermediate step, called the Electoral College. And Donald Trump appears to have won decisively in the Electoral College, and he will become president in January. In the House of Representatives, the House remains Republicans. The Democrats picked up some seats, but not enough to take control. The Speaker, Paul Ryan, is in a weak position. He did not actively back Trump, and there is some tension between him and Trump. In general, the power of the Speaker of the House has been declining because of internal rules changes, for instance, no longer allowing earmarks and so on. It is likely that when the Congress caucuses in January, when the new Congress caucuses in January, there will be a challenge to Speaker Ryan, though I don't think that challenge will be successful. In the Senate, the Republicans have held control narrowly, although two seats are still not determined. And they will probably pick up some more seats in 2018. The way that it works in the United States, we elect all the seats in the House of Representatives every 2 years, but the terms in the Senate are 6 years and they're staggered. So you only elect a third of the senators in each election. And it just so happens that in the election 2 years from now, the Democrats will be defending many seats, and the Republicans will not be defending so many. So it's likely the Republicans may pick up some additional seats in the Senate in 2018. In the Senate, there is something called the filibuster, and that is where someone who has very strong objections to a measure can stand up and talk endlessly. You may have seen the old movies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where people stand up and they talk and talk, or they read the Bible, or whatever. Those rules were changed to allow people to effectively invoke a filibuster without actually having to stand up and talk. And that means that the filibuster has begun to be used very promiscuously. There were rules changes made a couple years ago when the Senate was in control of the Democrats to make it possible to stop a filibuster, to shut it down with only a majority vote instead of a supermajority. What this means now is that on many issues, the Democrats' ability to obstruct Republican initiatives is going to be limited. There are still some issues such as the confirmation of Supreme Court justices that require supermajority, but the Democrats are not going to be able to just play an obstruction game. And so what this means is Republicans now control the presidency, both houses of the Congress, and they're going to have to govern. They will be responsible for what happens. One of the things that people have been really upset about is so-called gridlock. Well, now one party controls everything. They actually have to govern. Just in passing, before I go on to talk about more substantive matters, just a note on how did it happen, since this was not the predicted outcome. First of all, voting turnout is down considerably. It was a very negative election and basically turned people off. The Republican vote totals over the last, popular vote totals over the last 3 elections have remained fairly flat. What's really changed is the Democrats have trended down dramatically. In this electoral cycle, African Americans simply didn't come out to vote in the numbers that they had in the two previous elections when Barack Obama was on the ballot. Mrs. Clinton lost the working class decisively. She even lost working class women, despite the fact that she was a woman and would have been the first woman president, despite the fact of Donald Trump's widely reported misogynistic comments and behavior. She even lost working class women. Trump won whites, which with the fall off in African American voting were a larger share of the electorate. He won the non-college educated and did surprisingly well among Hispanics. People thought that the growth in the Hispanic vote would be decisively Democratic. Trump actually ran better among Hispanics than Mitt Romney did 4 years ago. And he had surprisingly long coattails. There's been a trend over time in the United States for people to vote so-called straight ticket, to vote for a single political party for all the positions on the ballot. But Trump was so controversial that people thought there might be a reversal of trend and much more ticket splitting. That does not seem to have happened, and his success seems to have carried along some Republicans in the Senate and the House. So what will he do? The issues that he emphasized, well, actually, I was going to say he emphasized a number of issues in the campaign. He actually didn't emphasize many issues in the campaign. This campaign was actually remarkably content-free. Neither candidate really addressed issues. It was mainly about personalities and name-calling. But to the extent that Trump did emphasize issues, the issues that he emphasized and the issues that seemed to be most salient with voters coming out of the poll booths in the exit polls were immigration and trade. And so let me quickly focus a bit on immigration taxes, because I think this is an important part of what's going to happen, especially from a Korean standpoint, and trade. And because of his inexperience, he's never served in the government, he's never served in the military. I believe he's the first president to hold that distinction. His appointments are really going to matter. And Chris Christie is the head of his transition team, is a very important man at the moment. It's also the case, as we were discussing at the breakfast table, that many of the traditional Republican foreign policy office holders signed public letters saying they would never vote or never work for Trump. And so either these people are going to have to go back on their public statements, or the set of appointees is going to be drawn from a significantly different pool than you've seen in previous Republican administrations. So among the names being mentioned, for example, for Treasury, the leading candidate by far seems to be Steve Mnuchin, a former Goldman Sachs executive. Other names include Representative Jen Hensarling from Texas, and kind of a dark horse candidate is the elderly private equity investor Henry Kravis. At state, John Bolton, who some of you may remember from the Bush administration, his role in the UN. He's the guy with the big white mustache. John Bolton is probably the leading candidate, becomes Secretary of State. The most prominent Republican foreign policy guy who did not come out against Trump, which everyone interpreted as him kind of keeping himself viable, was Steve Hadley, former National Security Advisor. He's another name possibly mentioned at State or at Defense. And then other names include former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich and Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee. At Defense, the person who one would think is the leading candidate is retired Army Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. The problem with General Flynn is he's technically ineligible. To serve in the Defense Department, you have to be off of active duty for 7 years. And General Flynn has not been off of active duty. So it would require a special measure of Congress to make him eligible. So it's possible he could get the job. Others include Senator Jeff Sessions of Alabama, Steve Hadley, who I already mentioned, and former Senator Jim Talent of Missouri. And they're going to be, it's interesting, no one has been mentioned as a potential USTR in a Trump administration. That could be a very interesting job. But the point I would just emphasize is, given his inexperience, given the lack of policy detail, these appointments are really going to matter, because these people are going to be making policy, I think, to a greater degree than might be the case in other administrations. So what about substance? Trump's signature issue is the forcible deportation of 11 million undocumented migrants and the building of a wall along our border with Mexico, which the Mexicans will pay for. Over the course of the campaign, he backed away from those statements to the point that by the end, honestly, I could not tell the difference between the Trump policy and the policy of the Obama administration, which has actually built some walls and has actually deported a lot of people. So it's really hard to say what he will do on immigration. If he were to try to deport 11 million people, some of them are Koreans, I might add, it would require basically the creation of a new police force. And you would have to go door to door trying to find people, and then you would undoubtedly deport some American citizens along with the illegal aliens, and it would harm the economy because these undocumented migrants make up about 6% of the labor force. So I don't think he's actually going to do what he says, but he's going to have to do something, having made that such a prominent a part of his campaign. We'll get a very early indication because on his website, and I double-checked this morning just to make sure I had the facts right, on his website, he says his first day in office, I guess in between getting sworn in and going to the inaugural balls, he's going to change, he's going to amend the Patriot Act by executive order to bring money transfer services such as Western Union under the Act to the Know Your Client provisions, which will have the effect of effectively cutting off remittances from the United States to Mexico. Then he's going to tell the Mexicans, all right, you pay for the wall or I allow this provision to go into effect, at which point the Mexicans will pay for the wall, according to Trump. the reason I raise this is, his claim is so specific, and it is so early on, that it will give you an indication about maybe how seriously to take the rest of this. And if he actually does try to go through with this, it will cause enormous trouble with our relations with Mexico. Interestingly enough, net flow of migrants now is from the United States to Mexico, not the other way around. And indeed, as I get to the trade part, if he actually implements the trade policy he's campaigned on, he will put the Mexican economy into recession. And in fact, the flows will reverse, and we will have more Mexicans in the United States, along with more illicit activities, not less. Okay. Now, fiscal policy, taxes. He's promised personal income tax cuts, but those are small peanuts compared to the corporate tax cuts that he's promised. He's promised to lower the corporate tax rate in the United States from 35% to 15%. Neutral third-party observers estimate that the Trump tax policies would cost the U.S. government $2.6 trillion in revenue over 10 years. In addition to cutting taxes massively, he says he's going to rebuild our infrastructure and increase expenditures on defense. Certainly, the rebuilding of infrastructure is something he will probably get support among Democrats in the Congress. So if you put those two things together, massive tax cuts and increased spending, obviously you're going to have rapidly growing budget deficits in the United States. What that will mean in the short run is probably accelerated growth in the United States and an appreciation of the dollar. So if you get accelerated growth in the United States and an appreciation of the dollar, you will get widening trade deficits. Which brings me to the topic of trade. Trade was another one of his signature issues and one of the two issues that were most salient with Trump voters in the exit polls. He has promised to put punitive tariffs on China and Mexico. He says on his website that his first day in office, I guess while he's not building the wall with Mexico, before he and Melania go off to the dances, he's going to name China a currency manipulator and then put some sort of countervailing duty on China. It's a good idea. The problem is it's not consistent with existing U.S. law. Under U.S. law, China today is not a currency manipulator. No country is under U.S. law. But that's just a detail. Punitive tariffs on China and Mexico. He's actually even talked about having firm-specific tariffs, which is a really strange idea, which is historically unprecedented, I believe is unconstitutional, though I'm not a lawyer, under our Equal Protection Clause, and certainly violates our WTO obligations. People have speculated why that is the case, and they have noticed that some of his most biggest advisors and financial backers own firms in Mexico that export to the United States. So perhaps that is the reason why he's thinking about firm-specific tariffs. He is very upset about disastrous trade agreements, free trade agreements. Obviously, the worst is NAFTA. Second worst is KORUS. He and his campaign repeatedly referred to KORUS as a job killer, which they've said various times they've claimed that it killed 85,000 to 100,000 U.S. jobs. Now, the problem with his comments on both NAFTA and KORUS and other agreements, there is a lack of specificity. So you can imagine a range of outcomes ranging from he abrogates NAFTA and abrogates KORUS, which is, I think, a real possibility, to a situation in which, having made these statements, and there are complaints on the United States side about the implementation of KORUS, that they essentially negotiate some side agreements with the Korean government. So the agreement remains in place. The visa waiver program remains in place. It doesn't really disrupt relations with Korea very much, but there is some additional negotiations. So it's a wide range of possibilities. He's also said that if he doesn't get his way, and I think the real problems he's going to encounter are with China and Mexico, not with South Korea. If he doesn't get his way, and the WTO rules against him, then he will withdraw from the WTO. Now, I should make something very clear here. Unlike much of the immigration policy, and unlike the tax and spending policies where he's got to work with the Congress, these trade policies he can effectively do by executive fiat. One of my colleagues, Gary Huffbauer, who's not only a formidable economist but a lawyer, went through all the statutes, and there are about a half a dozen statutes on the books, and where he can do this unilaterally without any kind of congressional oversight. Mike Gadbaugh from the Georgetown University Law Center looked at the same issue, reached the same conclusion. So in the trade area, he has a lot of autonomy. Needless to say, TPP is dead. His concerns about currency manipulation could also entangle Korea, where Bank of Korea's behavior from the standpoint of the United States leads something to be desired. And so bottom line is, this is shaping up to look like a really bad version of the first Reagan administration, where you had very expansionary fiscal policy, an appreciating dollar, widening trade deficits, and then bad trade policy to try to compensate for the widening trade deficits. So if I'm a Korean, I'm looking 1 to 2 years out, I expect trade problems with the United States because of this basic context. Plus, there may be specific things having to do with trade wars with China or whatever. Finally, let me just say a little bit about North Korea. As it says in my notes, who knows? One thing about Donald Trump is when you watch him, he seems to have a remarkably transactional view of the world. So at one point he said, yes, he would sit down with Kim Jong-un for a hamburger and Coke, and they would sort out the nuclear issue. And I think he probably does believe, and he may well be right, that in a one-on-one negotiation, he will out-negotiate Kim Jong-un. So, I mean, it may be he sits down for a hamburger and Coke with Kim Jong-un and resolves the nuclear situation. He also got on CBS News and television and said that he thought China should assassinate Kim Jong-un to take care of the problem. So we've got a range of policy options running from killing Kim Jong-un to having a hamburger with Kim Jong-un. And so, to go back to what I said earlier, who he appoints is really important. Because his inexperience and his kind of all over the map kind of pronouncements about policy means who's actually running the North Korean policy review and what kind of ideas they're coming up with is going to be really important. Likewise, he doesn't like existing status of forces agreements. He thinks Korea should pay more. So if I'm Korea, don't be surprised if the United States comes knocking and wants to renegotiate the SOFA agreement. He's made wild statements about nuclear weapons, basically saying that he thought Japan and South Korea having nuclear weapons would be a good idea, and even making kind of light comments about a nuclear exchange between North Korea and Japan. Again, who he appoints is going to really matter, because his own views seem to be so all over the map. And on that presumably unsatisfying note, I think I will end my comments.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for a very quick but very comprehensive overview of what will happen, which is quite unpredictable though. Since he has to leave here in 10 minutes or so, so if you have any urgent questions or comments, just maybe one or two take up, and then we'll have him leave. Okay, Dan Kirk, yes. Yes.
I was interested in that John Bolton may be Secretary of State. In his visits here, he's made a lot of, over the years that is, he's made a lot of very tough comments about North Korea. I realize that, you know, it's very uncertain what Mr. Trump's policies will be, but do you think John Bolton is Secretary of State? And also, well, going back to his tough comments in the UN, do you think as Secretary of State, he'll be as tough toward North Korea as he sounded in speeches that he made here in Seoul and in Washington and the United Nations? Thanks.
Everyone talks tough. until they actually have the responsibility of action. So I think, and this is not personal with respect to Mr. Bolton, I think that one has to assume that when in office and when given responsibility, people will temper some of the things they might say at a breakfast meeting, where ultimately there's nothing at stake. That said, I would be remiss if I didn't communicate to this audience, there is growing frustration in the United States, and it is bipartisan. You would have gotten this if Clinton had been elected as well. There is growing frustration with North Korea, and there's growing frustration with China. And I think that the first step is going to be more aggressive secondary sanctions against Chinese firms that do business with North Korea, and increasingly, and I would just cite the recent report by the Council of Foreign Relations as being a kind of mainstream conventional group, so-called kinetic options with respect to North Korea are increasingly contemplated. So whether John Bolton would do everything once in office he said he would, that would also depend on who the Secretary of Defense is. I don't know, but I think that if I were South Korean, I would be prepared for a harder line, more aggressive stance towards North Korea than you've seen for the last 8 years.
Okay. Ambassador Herb.
My question is not specifically about this, what Trump is going to do about North Korea or about trade policy, but rather more general, bigger picture. When we have this Brexit vote, many experts believe that it's not a good idea to vote for the Brexit, and probably they're going to vote for the Remain, but we turned out to be wrong. And I guess many of us here also believe that it will be probably Hillary Clinton rather than Mr. Trump, and turned out to be wrong again. And you came up with many factors that low turnout for the Democrats and all those stuff. But somehow I get this feeling that maybe we are misreading the world. The world is changing much, much more fundamental level, and we keep missing it and coming up with different reasons. So we might be right on specifics, but we might be missing a much bigger picture. So that's my question. Are we actually on the wrong side of the history or anything like that?
I probably should have mentioned this in my remarks. And since I know that we're on the record and there are television cameras, I'm not going to name names. But I won a substantial amount of money last night from some of my colleagues. One of my colleagues said that Donald Trump, he publicly stated that Donald Trump had a 0% chance of winning. I said, well, if that's the case, I should bet $2. You should accept a bet of me betting $2 against your entire personal estate, if you think it really is that. And he backed off of that, but we eventually got down to a reasonable bet, and which I won, and he sent me an email this morning saying he'd been by my office to settle up. And the reason I was willing to bet my colleagues was I thought the polls had it wrong. And the reason I thought the polls had it wrong was, and there's various terms for this, the Bradley effect, the Thatcher effect, the Brexit effect, the shy voter effect. It comes down to people were embarrassed to tell pollsters they were going to vote for Trump. Because Trump, he's kind of, Don Kirk probably has a good vocabulary word for it, but you don't want to admit that you're actually going to vote for this guy. He's sort of uncouth. And so I thought the polls were all wrong. And the polls being wrong, together with, Hillary Clinton not being able to mobilize African Americans in the way that Obama did, and so on and so forth, led to the outcome that we have. But to your deeper question, I think what's happened, and I can speak most clearly to the United States, in the last 2 generations, we've had a tripling of international trade in the economy. So the U.S. economy has globalized dramatically. It is globalized dramatically at the same time that we have not expanded in any way the social safety net or increased adjustment programs for people who are disadvantaged by that expansion of trade. At the same time that's going on, Immigration has been relatively high by historical standards, and it is coming largely from non-European sources. So what you have in the United States are a group of older white people who see the country that they grew up in disappearing before their eyes. They don't have the jobs they used to have, their kids don't have the jobs they used to have, and everybody who's moving into the neighborhood looks different than they do. You know, eats different kind of food, may speak a different language, and so on. So there is a deep cultural apprehension among that older generation about these changes. And if you look at the public opinion polling data in the United States, attitudes towards globalization have a very strong intergenerational trend. Young people are much more cosmopolitan, much more comfortable with it. Even the young people who were supporting Bernie Sanders were supporting him because of his authenticity and free college education, not because of his opposition to TPP. They were supporting him in spite of his opposition to TPP. They're quite comfortable with globalization, but the older generation is not. And I think that what we saw in Britain, which I don't know as well, and certainly what we saw in the United States, was a reaction or a revolt by the people who think they have been left behind by these changes and nobody has been listening to their problems. And Donald Trump, who, for whatever you think about him, he is a very effective political entrepreneur, managed to harness that anger and that disappointment, and he's ridden it to the White House.
Okay. Yes, that's the last question, comments. Yes, Mr. Kim. Yes.
Thank you. When I visited New York a couple of months ago, it was right after the Brexit vote. I met some of my friends in New York, and many of them objected to Trump. But one person, he was a chief economist of an investment bank. He had a quite different view. He told me that Donald Trump can be elected the president, and when he elected the president of the U.S., he can be very successful. When Ronald Reagan was first run as a presidential candidate at first, he was quite despised upon by many U.S. citizens, but he was very successful, he told me. So my question is that whether we like it or not, the election is over, we have to accept the result. In your view, do you think Donald Trump can be a very successful president or not for the U.S. or for the world? Thank you.
That's a completely unfair question. Of course, I hope he is successful. This was an unbelievably nasty campaign. It violated norms that most of us thought were just embedded in stone. It brought extremist groups out of the woodwork who we thought had been successfully repressed. This was truly ugly. Having said that, last night in his acceptance speech, or his victory speech, or whatever, Trump did the pivot that people were expecting at the convention, a pivot towards greater inclusivity. Whether he is able to successfully carry that out is going to depend not only on himself, but I can't overemphasize this, who he appoints. If he appoints reasonable politicians who I may not agree with on policy, but are not crazy people, like Mike Pence, he may be able to manage this situation. If he appoints people who have very strange views or kind of do not know how to speak in public, this could be very, very messy. The one thing I would say about Ronald Reagan had been both head of the Screen Actors Guild and governor of California. So Ronald Reagan had dealt with political roles in a broad sense before he became president. And certainly governor of California is a very important position. Trump lacks any kind of conventional political experience. And honestly, the other thing I would be, if I were Korean, I would be expecting, and I hope this is not the case. I truly hope it's not the case as an American citizen and as somebody who cares about the world. But I would expect the amateur hour for the first year. That it's just going to be chaos. Unless They do a very good job in this transition, and they really get a good set of people in very quickly. Otherwise, this could be very difficult. The one thing he has going for him, I suppose, is the Republicans control both houses of Congress. So congressional relations will be fairly cordial. He won't be fighting the Congress every day the way that Hillary Clinton would have. I hope for all of our sakes that he has a successful presidency. And I hope that his speech he gave last night is a signal that he has the capacity to turn and to reorient himself and the people around him in a more constructive way than what they showed during this campaign.
Okay. He has
And on that happy note.
He has to run. You have a quick question? Yes, Stella. Yeah. Yes, one.
Okay. I do have to run.
Thank you, sir. So I just have a quick question about, I guess, some possibilities of defense ministries that we're going to see with Trump administration, especially when it comes to provocations that we've seen from North Korea. So Obama administration has been sticking to this strategic patience with North Korea for a really long time now. And and even some of the experts that I've talked to, they talked about freezing nuclear weapons while accepting North Korea as a nuclear armed state. So are we going to see any sort of this strategic patience with Trump administration, in your opinion? Thank you.
Patience has worn very thin. That's the starting point. But remember, Trump is an entirely transactional character. So if he can make a deal, he'll make a deal. It may be like Nixon going to China or Menachem Begin going to Egypt. It may take somebody who's sort of as crazy and with hardline views, as Donald Trump to make a deal with North Korea. Anyway, I got to run.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your time.
It's okay. We have to let him go, and we should get him back soon, and some other time. Okay. Thank you very much, Mark, for your very, very good insight. Now, let's give the podium to Dr. Son. Yes, please. Yes.
Good morning. In English, there's a saying, we got caught with our pants down. 한국말로 하면은 화장실에 갔다가 이제 볼일을 보고 이게 팬츠를 올리기 전에 이제 탈로가 나다는 얘기죠. So it's a very commonly used language. We got caught with our pants down. And that's pretty much what happened to a lot of us yesterday. In fact, I spent many hours preparing for this speech, assuming that we will have a President Clinton rather than President Trump. So as you can imagine, last night I didn't get any sleep because I had to redo the entire speech. And then so, but I guess, in a nutshell, I'm actually a bit more optimistic about Trump presidency, abstracting away from foreign policy. It could actually be a positive for the U.S. economy. I think it's good that we have an outsider, not a person in Washington, a traditional politician, running the U.S. economy. So I do have obviously some concerns, as you will see in a minute, but my basic thesis is that it is not as bad as you think. It may actually be pretty positive for the, certainly for the U.S. economy and the global economy. So, given the election, this was, as Mr. Nolan pointed out, it's been a very controversial election, especially because so-called the unfavorable rating was so high. For example, if you look at the Trump's unfavorable rating right before the election was 63%. And then if you look at Clinton's unfavorable rating was 55%. And then you have to go back to 1960s when Barry Goldwater was running for president. And the unfavorable rating was never been this high. So what I'm trying to say is that this really led to a lot of uncertainties. We had an unprecedented amount of uncertainties in the United States and elsewhere. And that is very important for the financial markets and the economy. As we say, in the financial markets, in the economy, we can handle bad news, but not uncertainties. But I guess one good news is that now one of the major uncertainties that's out of the way. We know who the next president is. And as Dr. Nolan pointed out, as we get a better picture on who his cabinet members are, who his assistants are in the White House, we will get much better bearing on economic and foreign policy in the future. So I would say one of the reasons why the stock market has done very well, as you know, in the United States today, which has just closed, the stock market has done very well. The Dow Jones went up by over 2%. And bank stocks, for example, financial services stocks, which were really beaten down during the campaign, in part because of uncertainties, went up 5 points in a single day, 5 percentage points. And so you can see financial markets are reacting to it very, very positively. So uncertainty, that is diminishing somewhat. And the other thing I guess I want to point out again is that, campaign rhetoric is rhetoric. This happens all the time. During the campaign, candidates say a lot of things, but they either backtrack or the staff would modify it so that simply because they said it during the campaign does not mean that that's what they're going to do. And that's when the reality begins. And I think Dr. Nolan is correct in saying that since the president-elect, he's a relative newcomer to politics, who he appoints as his lieutenants, that's going to be very, very important. But let me just dive into Trump's economic programs. Here you see Trump's tax plan. And essentially it's a supply-side incentives. On the left-hand side, that means a tax increase under Clinton, and that's no longer be the case. If you look at the right-hand side, you see Trump tax cuts. Essentially, Mr. Trump has borrowed a page from Ronald Reagan, and he wants to cut taxes, not for the poor, but for the wealthy. And he's going to rely on supply-side, so-called trickle-down economics to make sure that the economy does better. Now, I'm not disparaging it. I happen to think that this is one of the ways that we can boost the U.S. and the global economy. And you can also, the other thing that I want to point out is that if you look at the tax cut, most of the tax cuts go to so-called the wealthy. People at the low end of the income spectrum, people with less income, low income, they're not going to get much. But again, it is a supply-side program. Clearly, as a result, federal debt as a percent of GDP, which is already high, that will continue to probably rise, and that's what people say. But wait a minute. There's a caveat. In economics, we talk about so-called static and dynamic models. Static model means, there's no follow-through. When we talk about dynamic models, that means it will have supply-side effects. It will have secondary positive effects. And so if you take that, I think we have a very different picture. Here you see what happened after Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in UK. Now, I don't have economic numbers, but you can see what happened in the stock market. After Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979, you can see the stock market and the economy, by the way, and the financial markets in the United Kingdom went up very, very nicely. This was a very, very positive case, and that's why today it was called, Thatcher Revolution, which spread beyond the British Isles. In the United States, something similar happened. You can see when Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, you see what happened to the stock market and the economy. We've had a supply-side effect. So my belief is that Trump, when he executes his program, I'm not sure to what degree, maybe not exactly, but his supply-side programs that will have positive effects. The concerns that budget deficits will go sky high, and that will mean doom and gloom for the U.S. economy and the global economy. I don't think that's correct. Again, I'm just giving you what happened in the UK in case of Margaret Thatcher, and also what happened in the United States after Ronald Reagan. We will see supply-side effects. Clearly, supply-side effects, they are not positive for everybody. There will be winners and losers, and there will be complainers. But on balance, for macroeconomy, I think we will see a very positive supply-side consequences for the U.S. economy. Now, in addition to that, there are other things that I see which is positive in Trump's economic program. First of all, he said he's going to spend a lot of money on infrastructure, up to $500 billion over the next 10 years, and that's quite a bit of money. When you talk about infrastructure, we're not just talking about cement and then pick up the excavators and then the tractors and etc. When you spend that much money on infrastructure, there are a lot of IT people, for example, they need a lot of software. computers and equipment and technology, so that this will have benefits throughout the economy, not only in the United States, but hopefully through Asia, including Korea. So this is one of the major benefits. The other thing that he said was corporate tax reforms. United States corporate tax rates are one of the highest in the world, and that is not right. That's one of the main reasons why many America's corporations, including Apple, General Motors, they have money sitting overseas. And when that money is brought back because of the corporate tax reform, that will be a spark, a stimulus, a positive for the U.S. economy and also for the global economy. The other thing that I really like about Trump's program is decrease in regulations. He said we have too many regulations. Again, as I said yesterday, in the United States, the financial stocks, the bank stocks went up by 5%. One of the main reasons is because Secretary Clinton said, I'm going to increase regulations. I'm going to put your financial institutions in a box. Well, Trump, he's saying that I'm going to dismantle, not erect new barriers, but dismantle regulations, and that is also very positive. I know in Korea, President Park has initiated that program. Let's curtail, reduce, dismantle government regulations. And to me, this is one of the best things any government can do in Korea, in the United States, dismantle government regulations, because this is so expensive. I wish I had 2 hours to talk about the evils of regulations, but I don't have that much time. But so those are some of the reasons. And also, when I talk about regulations, here are some of the industries which will benefit, such as healthcare, energy. I just talked about the banking and finance. And also, Hillary Clinton, she was going to raise the minimum wage. And many, many businesses were concerned about higher minimum wage, even McDonald's. They were thinking about how to use technology so that they don't have to use as many bodies, as many people. Well, without the fear of higher minimum wage, now I think we will see more and more America's firms, including McDonald's, hiring more low-wage employees. So this will be good for our economy. But having said that, again, so far, as you can see, I see, quite a bit of positives in Trump presidency, not so much negatives. And I think we all agree that there are some issues. And so that's what I call limits on Trump plan. One of them, I guess, is Congress. And again, Dr. Nolan pointed out that now we have Republicans controlling the White House, the Senate, and the House. Therefore, they can do anything they want. Well, theoretically, that's true. But, Mr. Trump's republicanism is very different from the philosophies of the Republicans on Capitol Hill, in the Senate and in Congress. And as a result, I don't necessarily think that we will have a unified government. In fact, even though they are called Republicans, I really see them behaving more like a divided Washington. White House under the control of Donald Trump. When you talk about Congress, Republicans, they've got their minds of their own. There are and there will be many differences. And what I'm saying is that this is actually positive. The economy and the financial markets, they like divided Congress, divided Washington. Why? Because they can't spend the money. Then they can't pass a lot of regulations. And let me give you what happened here. You can see single or divided government on GDP since 1962. If you look at the left-hand side, when we had a unified government, the stock market didn't do very well. If you look at the right-hand side, when we had the divided government, stock market did much better. Why? Again, they can't spend the money. They can't pass unnecessary stultifying regulations. And then I think this is what's going to happen. But clearly, I think, as Dr. Nolan pointed out, and I agree, we all worry that the biggest negative could be trade. And so let's talk about trade. I think it's unfortunate international trade has benefited everyone, Koreans, the Chinese, and the Americans. In America, I think the American economy has done as well as it has in the past because of free trade and international trade. America's largest export item is agriculture. And by the way, that's where a lot of votes were, the electoral college votes, where Mr. Trump won. And then also, America's technology companies, from Google to Microsoft, more than half of their income is coming from overseas. So when you talk about international trade, one of the primary beneficiaries of international trade has been the United States. And I hope we're not going to shoot ourselves in the foot, and that's one of my concerns. But when you talk about Mr. Trump on trade, assuming that he will follow through what he preached during the campaign, he's not just anti-trade, he's not just a protectionist, he's what I call isolationist. He's saying that America first, and then I'm going to build the walls, not only along the Mexican border, but trade walls as well. So to me, that is very, very dangerous. Again, Dr. Nolan pointed out the fact that this is one area where American president has a lot of discretionary authorities. Again, I don't have time to get into a lot of the things, but here you see 3 blocks. We have a trade agreements, as you can see, the first block, and then that requires obviously an act of Congress. If you look at the second block, you see the limited statutes. The president can raise tariffs, or he can impose trade sanctions on many countries and many products. And if you look at the bottom block, which is so-called emergency situation, then he can almost do anything. So without the consent of the Congress, you can see President Trump can really do a lot of things, and this is where he can do a lot of that damage. And this is where I think Korea could be very adversely affected, because the Korean economy is a very trade dependent. And it's such a large portion of the economy, and then so that's one of the problems that we have here. And then so here's the modeling that we did on impact of the trade war on growth. We said, let's assume that Mr. Trump actually follows through with his threats, and then also let's assume that we impose a 45% tariff on Chinese goods, and 45% tariff on Korean goods, and 35% tariff on Mexican goods, and etc. And also we assume that the Chinese and the Koreans and the Mexicans, they would retaliate, and then so you can see what happens to economic growth. If you look at the blue bars, that is a subtraction, decrease in economic growth in the United States. If you look at those green bars, those are the assumptions that, again, United States, we impose tariffs and sanctions, and the Koreans and the Chinese and the Mexicans, they do not retaliate, they sit back and do nothing. Obviously, that's not going to be the case, but just for the sake of explanation, you can see, even in that situation, it is bad for the U.S. economy. It hurts the U.S. economy. United States, like anyone else, needs trade for economic growth. What's unfortunate is that if you have a tariff wall, if you have protectionism, it is not so much the rich who gets hurt. Mr. Trump and the rich people, they're not that affected that much by a higher cost of living. But when you look at the low-income people in America, they need cheap Chinese goods, they need cheap Chinese shoes and bicycles, and the light bulbs and etc. And they're the ones who are going to be losing most jobs. So it is not really the rich, but people who are at the lower end of the income spectrum, they're the ones who's going to be really hurt. In fact, as you recall, President Obama decided to impose tariffs on Chinese tires, about 3-4 years ago. And to make long story short, and here's an estimate from Peterson Institute that you just heard from, and then Obama tariff on tire, it saved 1,200 jobs. Not created, but saved 1,200 jobs. But the study shows that it cost American taxpayers $900,000 per job. And a lot of people don't realize that. Simply, we hear that, wow, that's great, we saved 1,200 jobs. Mr. Obama never talked about the fact that it cost almost $1 million per job. Well, when you have a less trade, that means that not only the poor people who have to pay more because they need cheap imports, but also they're the ones who lose jobs, but also America in general, and Koreans in general, the Chinese in general, they get hurt. Why? Because we have more monopolies and oligopolies. A good example in the United States is sugar. Sugar has a strong tariff, and strong, as a matter of fact, not tariff, but quotas. So you cannot import more than so much sugar into the United States. Why? Because the sugar industry has and continue to be very, very powerful, which means that sugar goes into everything from candy to all the cooking that we do. And so the cost of sugar is very high in the United States for that reason. And so with less trade, we will see more and more of these. Now, having said that, free trade does not mean it is a panacea for everyone. There are losers by definition. When you have a free trade, there will be winners and there will be losers by definition. The thing is that you want to take some of the benefits from the winners and then give it to the poor. And that's really the idea. That's how it's supposed to work. But that has not exactly worked out. If you look at the U.S. public non-financial firms' return on equity, you can see the large firms, the multinational corporations, they have done very well. In Korea, chaebols, they've done very well. Why? Because they have been the primary beneficiaries of a free trade. But if you look at the people at the low end of the income spectrum, people who are losing manufacturing jobs, they obviously have suffered. In the United States, if you look at this chart, about 20% of manufacturing jobs were lost to China, 20%. Now, many people think it's like 80 to 90%, but it's not that high, about 20%. But unfortunately, we spend only 0.1% of GDP on training. We should be spending not 0.1%, but we should be spending, I think, 5% of our GDP on training and education. Let me move on to the general trend. Even before Trump became a candidate, deglobalization, that was already occurring. Earlier, someone asked a question, and that is right. The deglobalization has been going on for a while. It predates Mr. Trump, and also as a result of the global recession that we went through in 2007, 8, and 9, that really gave rise to more protectionism and then deglobalization. You can see what's been happening. International trade has been moving sideways, and it is now going up. It's going down, and then I'm afraid that that might be the trend. We all have heard about the term populism, right? Populism. When we talk about populism, we're talking about anti-establishment. It is not about the left or right. Bernie Sanders on the left, he was a populist. Donald Trump on the right, he's a populist. It is more about the open or closed economies rather than left or right. And the biggest issue, of course, immigration. And this has played a key role in Brexit, and this again has played a key role in America in electing Donald Trump. And here's a map out of the New York Times, and you can see the red, those are the states that Mr. Trump won, and the blue, those are the states where Secretary Clinton won. But the point that I want to make is that if you look at this chart, okay, when you look at the East Coast and West Coast, this tells you how many foreigners, immigrations, the individual states have received. When you see those darker colors, for example, really the green colors, that means there have been a lot of immigrants from overseas, the people born overseas living in the United States, and I'm one of them in Southern California, see? As you go into the Midwest, okay, it's kind of white. That means that, they don't have that many immigrants, see? They're not used to foreigners like myself living amongst themselves. So that's the status quo. If you look at the next chart, this tells you between 2000 and 2015, over the last 15 years, how much immigration has changed. On the West Coast, like in California, on the East Coast, like in New York City, people are used to immigrants. They are used to living with them, working with them, but not in the Midwest. People living in the Midwest, what happened? In the last 15 years, they began to get immigrants from Korea to China and Mexico, and they're saying that, whoa, it's too many, see? And the life as I knew, that is changing. And that's, of course, precisely what happened in case of Brexit. And this is one of the reasons why Mr. Trump, as I pointed out, won just about every state between California and New York State, see? Why? Because those are the states which are not used to immigrants, not used to foreigners, but in the last 15 years, they've been inundated with a lot of immigrants. So if you look at the number of immigrants as a population, it's still small in the Midwest, but the rate of change has been very high, and that's why they decided to vote for Mr. Trump. And here's a little town in Arcadia, Wisconsin. And then here, 15 years ago, only 3% of the population was Hispanic. Now, 15% of the population is Hispanic, and the population of the town is only 4,500. And 1,500 Hispanics, that makes a lot of difference, and then people have many concerns. Of course, here we are in Korea. So what impact will this have on the Korean economy? Probably quite a bit. Again, I will abstract away from foreign policy because that's not my expertise. But, I mean, we all agree that, Korea is a very open economy. Very dependent on international trade. China, 24% of Korean exports go to China. To the United States, 12%. And then so clearly international trade is very, very important. And that if we see more tariffs, more protectionism, and isolationism, I mean, Korea is one of the countries which is going to be affected most because, again, so far, Korea has been one of the primary beneficiaries of a more liberal international open trade in the past. If you look at the top trading partners of the United States in 2015, you can see, well, Korea is, we're talking about the trade between the United States and the rest of the world. You can see that Korea is at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sixth largest trading partner for the United States, accounting for about $71 billion. Of course, in 2016, it's going to be greater, closer to $80 billion in trade between Korea and the United States. And so that is at stake. Well, even before the election, here's what IMF said. The IMF said the probability of a global recession has really gone up. And in the United States, they said, 25%. In the euro area, about 35%. In Japan, about 40%. And Latin America, much higher, and the rest of the world. The point is that even before the Trump election, IMF was concerned about a possibility of a global recession. And again, Korea is one of the countries which could be affected by that because, again, Korea is so open and depends so heavily on global trade. So turning to Korea, so what does Korea do? How will this affect the Korea? I mean, to begin with, Korea has a number of what we call headwinds. First of all, I just talked about the global economy, right? Global economy is slowing. The global trade is slowing. IMF is saying that we are going to have, high, not high, but, reasonable possibility of a global recession in 2017, not 2027, but 2017. So that's one of the problems. So Korea is obviously, has some concerns to begin with. And also, Korea has what I call structural 3Ds. That is, structural problems. When I say 3D, I mean demographics, possibility of disinflation, and the demographics and disinflation, and those are some of the factors that Korea has a problem with. And then on top of that, we have, of course, the Trump factor. And then, of course, in Korea, you've got you know what I mean, the Choi gate. And then so we've got not only the global economy, but also the political problems coming from the United States, and then also internal problems in Korea. So what does Korea do? I mean, clearly, things will be different under President Trump. And so Korea, I'm assuming that has begun already to prepare for the renewed negotiations on trade and SOFA and other things with the United States. In fact, I was somewhat surprised that in the newspaper yesterday, the Wire report said Japan has already sent a vice prime minister to the United States to begin a new relationship. I'm not sure what Korea has done, but that's one of the things that we should do. That is, try to build relationship as soon as possible, and then try to find out what they have in mind, especially the lieutenants, the cabinet ministers, which may become Mr. Trump's lieutenants. And then, of course, there are short-term policy responses and then long-term policy responses in this situation. When we talk about long-term policy responses, again, one of the things, of course, is trying to find out what is Korea good at? What competitive advantages do you have? President Park talked about the creative economy. Again, I wrote a book about that, but this morning I don't have time to get into that. But again, the point is that we need to have obviously long-term responses given the global situation in the short run and the long run, and the political situation both in Korea and the United States. But since we have just a little bit of time left, I just want to talk about short-term responses. Again, when I came here about a year ago, I talked about the Bank of Korea's monetary policy. And in fact, I've been talking about the more dramatic cut in the interest rates by the Bank of Korea pretty dramatically. And let me talk about the fact that, to me, that is a short-term response. And there has to be a long-term response, but in between, you need to make sure that the economy doesn't go into a recession. You have to make sure that you undergird the economy in the short run, and that's where the monetary policy comes in. When I've been talking about the Bank of Korea cutting the interest rates dramatically, not now for last year, but I've been talking about that for 2 years. And a lot of people said that, what are you talking about? You don't live in Korea, so you don't know what you're talking about. Well, that might be so, but people said, don't you realize, Korea has a lot of household debt problems? And then we all agree that the household debt is pretty high, and that is something that we should be concerned about in Korea. But monetary policy should not be run based on household debt in Korea. It's a macroeconomic policy. And so I think the Bank of Korea should run monetary policy based on what is good for the macroeconomy, not for household debt, not for the auto industry, not for the housing industry, not for, Chairman Saigon. So you have to run monetary policy based on the macro, the global economy. And certainly I'm saying that in this situation, you need the more stimulative policy from the Bank of Korea. Now, when I talked about the zero interest rate, whether it's a 0 or 0.25, that doesn't really matter. What I'm saying is that, we need some institution in Korea doing something dramatic, something important to boost the psychology. And so that people in the street, they are saying that, our government is really doing something. And let me tell you, when Mr. Kuroda became central bank president after Mr. Abe became prime minister in 2012, he appointed Mr. Kuroda in Japan. And then they started, obviously, the massive quantitative and qualitative easing program, right? Well, the economy was caught by surprise, positively. And for a while, actually, the stock market and the economy did very well. The key is having a positive psychological effect, not so much the interest rate, not so much the money supply or liquidity, but having positive impact psychologically. I think that was what's important. Mr. Bernanke, when he was the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, he did the 3 quantitative easings. The first one was very successful. Why? Because we were caught by surprise. Again, as I pointed out earlier, we were caught with our pants down. People said, you know what, Washington, they are doing something. And the economy and the financial markets and the stock market responded very favorably. Now, second and third one did not because, people kind of knew about it already. See? What I'm saying is that when you have a dramatic cut in the interest rates by a central bank in Japan, in the United States, and hopefully in Korea, that will have a very positive psychological effects. The next one, I guess, is people also ask me, yeah, but the Federal Reserve, they are going to be raising the interest rate. Well, yeah, they are, but, we're not talking about raising the interest rates by a lot. Last December, they raised it by a quarter point. And next month, this is December, maybe by another quarter point. And a year from now, they may raise it by a quarter point. So we're not talking about raising a lot, see? So why should the Bank of Korea be, so much concerned about what the Fed is doing? And people say, well, that means money will be leaving Korea and to some other countries. I don't necessarily think so. A lot of money has been going into Japan. You know why? Because they have a confidence that Japanese economy is healthy, see? Not strong, but healthy. It's not going to fall apart. And money comes into the United States, Japan, and Switzerland. Why? Because they have a much more confidence in the stability of the economy, see? That's what matters, not whether interest rate is a quarter point higher or lower. And so, those are some of the reasons why I think it's very important that the Bank of Korea, they move as soon as possible. I know I am out of time, so I want to conclude my talk by giving you, saying one more thing. Yeah, don't try to read these charts, because it will hurt your eyes. And that's not why I brought this up here. 2 university professors in the United States, they did a research, and this was published in the Journal of Business and Economics in 2014. These 2 professors, what they did was they went back to the U.S. elections all the way back to President William McKinley. And then they said, how does the stock market respond the day after? So in the United States, the election was held on Tuesday, right? Okay? So they are saying, look at what happens to the stock market, not the following week, not the following month, not the following year, but just one single day, that Wednesday, okay? Right? And then if the stock market does well on that Wednesday, just one single day, that's a very good indication how the economy and the stock market will do in the next 4 years. Now, they're not giving you their opinions, but they are giving you their actual facts, empirical facts, and that's what this is. And then so, again, it will hurt your eyes, don't try to see it, but here's a correlation. Again, how the stock market did on that Wednesday, okay, in the United States, but by the way, it did very well, right? When the stock market went up by 2%, the financial stocks went up by 5%. And then until you can see like a mid-1985, mid-1980s, the correlation was actually negative to 0. But since 85, because of a better communication and internet and et cetera, the correlation now is about 67%, see? And again, I guess the key is at the end of the day, let me conclude my speech by saying that, well, this is what history tells you. History tells me that, I might be right. Actually, the stock market has said that yesterday, despite what people have said, they're actually feeling pretty good about the Trump presidency. They are seeing some positive things, at least in the United States. Now, Korea could be a different situation. And so let's hope that in the next 4 years, the stock market and the financial markets and the economy will do well. And that clearly will mean that Korea will benefit from that as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for very, very interesting and insightful, illuminating views, not only for the United States and for the rest of the world, and particularly for Korea. Well, with this, we don't have much time, but why don't I invite some comments or questions? It's a very rare opportunity to have Dr. Son with us at this very moment. Yeah. Any questions? Yes, there's one. And why don't I collect a couple of comments?
한국말로 하겠습니다. 박사님 그 말씀 잘 들었는데요. 그러면은 지금 미국의 일자리를 창출하기 위해서 한국이라든지 전 세계에 대해서 약간 보수인 무역 경향을 할 거로 보여지는데, 제 생각에는. 그래서 한국 기업들, 예를 들면 한국에도 다양한 업종이 있지 않습니까? IT부터 시작해서 다양한 업종이 있는데, 이게 미국 그 보조로 인해서 수혜받을 수 있는 업종, 그 다음 피해를 받을 수 있는 업종, 기업을 이렇게 나눠본다면 어떻게 될까요? 감사합니다.
I mean, again, you heard the questions, right? And then so that many of the Korea's, manufacturing, the outputs, such as automobiles, even though quite a bit is produced in the United States, but the auto-related parts, and that's one of the areas where Korea has done a very good job of exporting to the United States. And then that's one of the areas where, Mr. Trump and his people are very concerned about. And then so that would be, the one area. The other one, of course, is, IT. Of course, a lot of Samsung IT, and then washers and dryers and TV sets, and a lot of electronic products are imported from the United States. And then if we are talking about putting 45% tariffs on Korean goods would not be competitive at all. Now, again, I hope that that's just a campaign rhetoric, but still there might be movement trying to raise some tariffs on Korean goods. And as I said, Mr. Trump, he can do that as a president without the approval of the Congress. And then so I think the Korean goods could possibly cost more in the United States, make it less competitive. And then so again, the other way around, of course. Korea imports America's agricultural goods, Boeing aircraft, for example, and then also electronic goods such as iPhones and etc. So that would be affected as well. So the trade on in both directions that would be affected. But again, I think the key items would be in the United States. The exports to Korea, the aircraft and agriculture, because those are really the two biggest items. Going from the Korean side to the United States, I would say, such as automobiles and then some electronic goods and shipbuilding. That's not doing well anyway. But those would be probably two of the industry which would be affected most negatively, I would say. Yeah.
저도 한국말로 질문 드리겠습니다.
예, 그렇게 하십시오.
네, 그 내년 그 한국 정부에서는 경제 성장률을 3% 정도로 제시를 하고 있는데 미국 새 정부의 뭐 무역 정책이나 이런 것들이 내년 한국 경제 성장률에는 어떻게 영향을 미칠지 혹시 좀.
Yeah, I mean, even the Bank of Korea now has lowered its economic growth projections to below 3%, right? But when we're talking about 3% economic growth, I really felt that it was a way too high, even before Trump presidency. With Trump presidency and political uncertainties coming both from the United States and from now Korea itself, this will probably have long-term effect at least through 2017. So I'm looking at economic growth in Korea closer to 2%, not closer to 3%. And then so that's one of the reasons why, as I said, in the short run, we need to do something fast. We saw what happened in the case of Japan. they kind of, took their time, and then they let the economy fall into recession and deflation. Once you get in there, it's very hard to come out. It's very important that you have to prevent the economy from sliding into a recession, sliding into a deflation. And so that's why I say as a short term, again, I want to emphasize, not as a long term, but as a short term measure, as I've been saying, it's very important that the Bank of Korea, that's one area that they can move very quickly and cut interest rates, not by a quarter point, but, dramatically. Again, not to belabor the points I've been saying, I've said this many times, in public. When you cut the interest rates, a quarter point at a time every 6 months, you're really wasting your ammunition. See? And then so, in the last, couple of years, the Bank of Korea has been cutting the interest rates by a quarter point every 6 months. What have we accomplished? You've simply, wasted ammunition. And then so I hope we don't have a whole lot of ammunition left at 1.25%. So I hope we utilize that ammunition judiciously. But again, to answer your question, the economic situation, I think, is much more serious than the Bank of Korea or the Ministry of Finance, and many people realize. So that I think Korea needs to move very quickly so that we do not become another Japan.
자, 이제 마지막으로 누가 있으면은 한 번만 더 질문하시고 없으면은 예.
네, 저는 좀 거시적으로 하나 질문드리겠습니다. 이번 대통령 선거 때 이민자 문제하고 그 반무역 정서, 반자유무역주의에 대한 그 정서가 강하게 나타났는데 이런 것들을 전체적으로 그 정의를 하자면 미국 내에 지금 비관용, 그 인톨러런스가 증가하고 있다는 걸 지금 제가 인식을 이렇게 느끼고 있는데 이런 현상들은 역사를 봤을 때 몽골이나 아니면 뭐 로마 제국에 봤듯이 다 쇠퇴기에 나타난 현상들이란 말이에요. 그러니까 이 지금 미국 트럼프 어떤 당선 이후에 이런 것들이 미국의 어떤 쇠퇴라 아니면 그렇게 해석을 해도 가능한지 아니면 어떻게 생각을 하시는지 비관용주의 증가가 결국은 미국의 쇠퇴를 의미하는 건 아닌지 하는 역사.
쇠퇴가 무슨 얘기죠? 쇠퇴? 예? decline. 그러니까, I mean, as an economist, again, what we are talking about, and most likely we will do protectionism and tariff barriers and et cetera. That's wrong. And we need more immigration, and we need more economic growth and more international trade. But I think you're right. That is, we are in the process of a deglobalization, and so deglobalization, that is bad. Globalization, that's good. And then so I think in the future, economic growth is not going to be that healthy. As a matter of fact, I've talked about it. I wrote a book in 2014, which was published in Korea. And the main topic of the book really was why I see long-term, stagnation, not stagflation, but stagnation. And I talked about the demographics. I talked about the productivity slowdown. And I didn't get into politics. But I would say that, based on economic fundamentals that I talked about in my book, that explains why we will see, long-term stagnation around the world, including, Korea. Now, on top of that, if you overlay the political situation in the United States, which is a reality, and the political situation in Korea, I think that probably will reinforce, accelerate the long-term trend that we have. Now, it's very easy for an economist to say that. But in reality, economists don't run the country. Economists don't, except Mr. Sagong, and the economists, don't run the White House. And then so you have to really be realistic. And hopefully, Mr. Trump, he will not only take the political situation into consideration, but also the economic consideration take into consideration as well. So. His positions on immigration, his positions on international trade, which is largely based on really politics, will be modified somewhat based on the economic reality, which is that we already have economic slowdown, stagnation, and then, hopefully it doesn't make it even worse. Yeah. Thank you very much.
아주 짧은 시간에 오늘 정말 좋은 말씀들 많이 해주시고 특히 우리 손성원 교수께서 아주 컴프레hen시브하게 우리나라 그 정책까지도 말씀해 주셨습니다만은 지금 송 교수께서도 마지막 결론을 이야기했지만은 결국 정치가 지금 잘 돼야 돼요. 지금 아까 한국 경제 헤드윈스 이야기한 게 트럼프 팩터니 지금 여지 구조적인 문제고 있고 제일 밑에 최게이트라고 했습니다만은 지금 우리 빨리 정치권에서 우리 국민 모두의 지혜를 모아서 이 난국을 헤쳐가는데 길을 찾지 않으면은 좋은 정책이 될 수가 없고 경제가 첫째 될 수가 없어요. 지금 정책 해답이 없는 것보다도 그거는 이 전문가들과 의견을 중지를 모으면 되게 돼 있는데 지금 이 정치 국정 난맥이 계속되어서는 안 되기 때문에 어떻게 하든 그것이 빨리 해결이 돼야 경제도 잘 될 수 있기 때문에 특히 아까 손 교수께서 말씀하셨습니다만은 일본서는 벌써 차관을 미국 당선인에게 보내고 합니다만은 우리는 아직 이렇게 돼서 누가 보내면 어디서 누가 갈지도 모르는 이런 상황이니까 우리 국민 모두의 지혜를 모아서 이 난국부터 빨리 돌파를 해가지고 대응을 해야겠습니다. 어쨌든 송 교수께서 내가 속에 말씀도 드렸지만은 굉장히 리얼리스틱한 이코노미스트로서 그 앞을 내다보는 해안이 특히 누구보다 뛰어나기 때문에 오늘 말씀해 주신 걸 우리 미디어에서 잘 커버를 해 주시고 또 우리 정부에서도 정치권에서 특히 잘 들어서 잘 대응을 해 줬으면 합니다. 그럼 오늘 송 교수께서 수고를 많이 하셨는데 여러분들 큰 박수로 환영합니다.